So before I begin the video, I will say this outright. I do not hate Zack Snyder as a director. As a matter of fact, I really enjoyed his movie The 300. I also thought that his version of Justice League was superior to the Joss Whedon cut released by Warner Brothers in theaters. And also, I will always be an advocate for Man of Steel. Despite the many flaws that the film does have, I do think it's a brilliant portrayal of an origin story for such an iconic character, and could have led to something that was fantastic in a portrayal. However, that's not exactly how things turned out. The DCEU fell completely flat and became a laughingstock for a while compared to the success of Marvel at the time. Now, when comparing the DCU Superman to the DCEU Superman, there are many key differences as to why one portrayal may be preferred over the other, and it's all down to personal preference. So if you are easily triggered in personal preference for Superman, I probably recommend clicking off the video if you are easily offended. But if you are open to hearing somebody who is not necessarily a Superman fanboy, but someone who has read the comic books after Man of Steel inspired me as a Superman fan, I can say that there are some things I noticed that were differences from the comic book compared to the portrayal that Zack Snyder was trying to go for and the portrayal that James Gunn is going for in his current DCU. But before we get started, make sure you guys hit the like button, subscribe if you have not already, and also leave a comment down below on which Superman you prefer, or if you just like both. It's okay to like both. I don't know why it's such a big deal nowadays for us to not like two separate portrayals of a character. These are portrayals for a reason, and honestly it's just down to personal preference if you like one over the other. Perfect example being Christian Bale versus Robert Pattinson. I really love Christian Bale as Batman. I grew up with him. But in terms of what I prefer in terms of a live action Batman, I prefer a younger, angrier, less experienced Batman, and that's why I like Pattinson. Now that we got all of that out the way, what are the key differences between David Corenswet's Superman and Henry Cavill's Superman? It really comes down to the ideology and the portrayal of both of these characters and how they were written. One was written to be a god amongst men that was set in much more of a realistic world setting and how the world would potentially react to something like this, and compared to an ultra comic booky David Corenswet universe Superman, where you see superheroes wearing trunks on the outside and fighting unrealistic threats and having expansive comic book characters throughout. Two are very different versions of the character, and we should dive into why one probably works a little bit better than the other, and why one has just been reacted to more positively than the other. So normally I would start off with Henry Cavill's portrayal, but I think that let's do a reverse this time. Let's start off with why David Corenswet I personally prefer as Superman compared to Henry Cavill. Henry Cavill, it was not his fault in terms of the writing, and it really does come down to the writing, but what works about Corenswet's version is how James Gunn wrote his Superman to be much more of the iconic, hopeful figure that we all know him to be from the comic books. Essentially, he wrote him to be just a good person who was raised on Earth who happens to have these metahuman abilities given to him by the sun. It's not really a quote-unquote god amongst men. It's a alien who was raised amongst men and raised to be a great person and just genuinely wants to do good. That's essentially the character archetype that's been for Superman for years, and it wasn't really until the early 2000s where they tried to make all these evil versions of Superman and the Injustice storylines where they tried to make Superman much more evil because they thought that would be more interesting to the modern audience. With as much as we've got going on in the world, maybe a little bit of positivity in our superhero movies is maybe not such a bad thing. Also, there was a component of fun to this version of the Superman character. Oftentimes with DC movies, we can see a lot of them get extremely dark, and that's been a main poking point that's been to DC for a while, is that all their films are dark and there's no fun to be had. This film actually was quite the opposite to what we're used to from DC, and I think it was a breath of fresh air and the perfect character to come from such a bright and colorful character. Now we look at Zack Snyder's take on Henry Cavill's Superman, and you can kind of see what they were going for in Man of Steel, where they essentially made him a god raised amongst men, and they wanted to show what it would be like if Superman existed more in the real world. Even though DC's fantastical in its names of its cities, but the portrayal of Henry Cavill's Superman was much more stoic, much more distant, which wasn't as relatable to audiences, and oftentimes did make Henry Cavill's performance seem very wooden, which is unfortunate because given the right writing, I think he could have been a lot more of a quote-unquote relatable Superman. That being said, I do like the setup that they had for Henry Cavill's Superman being much more of a doubtful, unsure of himself character, where essentially you see him by the end of the movie of Man of Steel become the Clark Kent character. He doesn't truly become Clark Kent, that dual persona, until the end of the film. And a lot of people dislike the controversial decision that he killed General Zod, but I thought it was a great decision and could have led to potentially great storylines in the future where you could have seen Superman have that kind of struggle within himself to not kill ever again. But unfortunately, Zack Snyder wrote this character to be kind of a murderous guy who everybody was afraid of. Even though he was kind of critiquing Batman and his methods in Batman vs. Superman, you saw this guy at the beginning of the movie fly a dude straight through a brick wall. And everybody's afraid of him. And it seemed like Zack Snyder was trying to set Superman up as more of a threat more than a positive force in these movies, because they were always alluding to Superman becoming evil rather than setting him up as a symbol of hope from the beginning. So really that turn wasn't as impactful, and it just felt kind of like dark and gritty and not in a great way. As a matter of fact, there are more moments where you see Henry Cavill's Superman looking scary more than actually looking positive in these movies. Now, whether one take is better than the other, that's all up to a personal opinion. I mean, it depends on what Superman you prefer. I'm just saying, from my perspective, if you're setting up a DC universe and you want to set it up right, you have to get the fundamentals of these characters down from the beginning and not always set them up as being a potential problem in the future from the beginning. What worked about James Gunn's version is the fact that he set him up as being a good person and a genuine hero from the beginning. Whereas with Man of Steel, you see him making a lot of errors, mistakes. A lot of people are just afraid of him. And not to mention the fact that they were already setting him up as being a potential threat in the future with those visions of the nightmare future. Also, the component of fun in these superhero movies was also severely lacking in the Zack Snyder universe. I mean, a lot of those movies I left out coming out not even really smiling. I just felt like really dirty. Whereas with this newer Superman movie, I've rewatched it many times because it's a very feel-good movie. Those are the very fundamental differences compared to Henry Cavill's Superman and David Corenswet's Superman. And once again, it's really up to personal preference on what your version of Superman is and what you particularly enjoy. I'm not saying one director is better than the other. I'm just saying that personally, for me personally, I think that David Corenswet's version was just written to be more like the traditional Superman that's from the comic books, and Henry Cavill's Superman definitely took a lot more liberties.